God-given prophecy is history in advance. Church history is his story of Jesus building his church in the world from his place seated at the right hand of the Father in providence. The History of Protestantism by James A. Wiley is perhaps one of the most complete chronicles of that history. Thank you for joining me. We will continue right where we left off last time. We cannot go into details. Prodigies of valor were performed by this little host. I had always considered the Vaudois to be men, said Discombes, who had joined them, but I found them lions. Nothing could withstand the fury of their attack. Post after post and village after village were wrested from the Piedmont troops. Soon the enemy was driven from the upper valleys. The war now passed down into the plain of Piedmont, and there it was waged with the same heroism and the same success. They besieged and took several towns. They fought not a few pitched battles, and in nearly all of them they were victorious, though opposed by more than 10 times their number. Their success could hardly be credited had it not been recorded by historians whose veracity is above suspicion, and the accuracy of whose statements was attested by eyewitnesses. Not infrequently did it happen at the close of a day's fighting that 1,400 Piedmont dead covered the field of battle, while not more than 6 or 7 of the Waldensian had fallen. Such success might be well termed miraculous. Not only did it appear so to the Vaudois themselves, but even to their foes, who could not refrain from expressing their conviction that surely God was on the side of the Barbettes. While the Vaudois were thus heroically maintaining their cause by arms, and rolling back the chastisement of war on those from whom its miseries had come, tidings of their wrongs were traveling to all the Protestant states of Europe. Wherever these tidings came, a feeling of horror was evoked, and the cruelty of the government of Savoy was universally and loudly execrated. All confessed that such a tale of woe they had never before heard. But the Protestant states did not content themselves with simply condemning those deeds. They judged it to be their clear duty to move in behalf of this poor and greatly oppressed people, and foremost among those who did themselves lasting honor by interposing in behalf of the people, drawn unto death and ready to perish, was, as we have already said, England. Then, under the protectorate of Cromwell, we mentioned in the previous chapter the Latin letter, the composition of Milton, which the protector addressed to the Duke of Savoy. In addition, Cromwell wrote to Louis XIV of France, soliciting his mediation with the Duke in behalf of the Vaudois. This letter is interesting as containing the truly Catholic and noble sentiments of England, to which the pen of her great poet gave fitting expression. Most sincere and potent king, after a most barbarous slaughter of the persons of both sexes and of all ages, a treaty of peace was concluded, or rather, secret acts of hostility were committed the more securely under the name of a pacification. The conditions of the treaty were determined in your town of Pinerolo, hard conditions enough, but such as these poor people would gladly have agreed to, after the horrible outrages to which they had been exposed, provided that they had been faithfully observed. But they were not observed. The meaning of the treaty is evaded and violated by putting a false interpretation upon some of the articles, and by straining others. Many of the complainants have been deprived of their patrimonies, and many have been forbidden the exercise of their religion. New payments have been exacted, and a new fort has been built to keep them in check, from whence a disorderly soldiery make frequent sallies, and plunder or murder all they meet. In addition to these things, fresh levies of troops are clandestinely preparing to march against them, and those among whom profess the Roman Catholic religion have been advised to retire in time, so that everything threatens the speedy destruction of such as escaped the former massacre. I do therefore beseech and conjure your majesty not to suffer such enormities, and not to permit, I will not say any prince, for surely such barbarity could never enter the heart of a prince, much less of one of the duke's tender age, or into the mind of his mother, those accursed murderers, to indulge in such savage ferocity who, while they profess to be the servants and followers of Christ, who came into the world to save sinners, do blaspheme his name and transgress his mild precepts by the slaughter of innocent men. Oh, that your majesty, who has the power, and who ought to be inclined to use it, may deliver so many supplicants from the hands of murderers, who are already drunk with blood, and thirst for it again, and who take pleasure in throwing the odium of their cruelty upon princes. I implore your majesty not to suffer the borders of your kingdom to be polluted by such monstrous wickedness. Remember that this very race of people threw themselves upon the protection of your grandfather, King Henry IV, who was most friendly disposed toward the Protestants. When the Duke of Lesdiguières passed victoriously through their country, as affording the most commodious passage into Italy at the time he pursued the Duke of Savoy in his retreat across the Alps. The act or instrument of that submission is still extant among the public records of your kingdom, in which it is provided that the Vaudois shall not be transferred to any other government, but upon the same condition that they were received under the protection of your invincible grandfather, as supplicants of his grandson. They now implore the fulfillment of this compact, given at our court at Westminster this 26th day of May, 1658. The French king undertook the mediation, as requested by the Protestant princes, but hurried it to a conclusion before the ambassadors from the Protestant states had arrived. The delegates from the Protestant cantons of Switzerland were present, but they were permitted only to act the part of simple observers. The Grand Monarch took the whole affair upon himself, and on the 18th of August, 1655, a treaty of peace was concluded of a very disadvantageous kind. The Waldenses were stripped of their ancient possessions on the right of the Pillage, lying toward the plain of Piedmont. Within the new boundary they were guaranteed liberty of worship. An amnesty was granted for all offenses committed during the war. Captives were to be restored when claimed, and they were to be exempt from all imposts for 5 years, on the ground that they were so impoverished as not to be able to pay anything. When the treaty was published, it was found to contain 2 clauses that astonished the Protestant world. In the preamble, the Vaudois were styled rebels, whom it had pleased their prince graciously to receive back into favor, and in the body of the deed was an article which no one recollected to have heard mentioned during the negotiations, empowering the French to construct a fort above La Tour. This looked like a preparation for renewing the war. By this treaty the Protestant states were outwitted, their ambassadors were duped, and the poor Vaudois were left as much as ever in the power of the Duke of Savoy and of the Council for the propagation of the faith and the extirpation of heretics. Chapter 13. The Exile. New troubles. Louis XIV and his confessor. Edict against the Vaudois. Their defenseless condition. Their fight and victory. They surrender. The whole nation thrown into prison. Utter desolation of the land. Horrors of the imprisonment. Their release. Journey across the Alps. Its hardships. Arrival of the exiles at Geneva. Their hospitable reception. After the great massacre of 1655, the Church of the Valleys had rest from persecution for 30 years. This period, however, can be styled one of rest only when contrasted with the frightful storms which had convulsed the era that immediately preceded it. The enemies of the Vaudois still found innumerable ways in which to annoy and harass them. Ceaseless intrigues were continually breeding new alarms, and the Vaudois had often to till their fields and prune their vines with their muskets slung across their shoulders. Many of their chief men were sent into exile. Captain Gianavello and Pastor Ledger, whose services to their people were too great to ever be forgiven, had sentence of death passed upon them. Ledger was to be strangled, then his body was to be hung by one foot on a gibbet for 24 hours, and lastly his head was to be cut off and publicly exposed at San Giovanni. His name was to be inserted in the list of noted outlaws. His houses were to be burned. Gianavello retired to Geneva, where he continued to watch with unabated interest the fortunes of his people. Ledger became pastor of a congregation at Leyden, where he crowned a life full of labor and suffering for the gospel by a work which has laid all Christendom under obligations to him. We refer to his History of the Churches of the Vaudois, a noble monument of his church's martyr heroism and his own Christian patriotism. Hardly had Ledger unrolled to the world's gaze the record of the last awful tempest which had smitten the valleys, when the clouds returned, and were seen rolling up in dark, thunderous masses against this devoted land. Former storms had assailed them from the south, having collected in the Vatican. The tempest now approaching had its first rise on the north of the Alps. It was in the year 1685. Louis XIV was nearing the grave, and with great audit in view, he inquired of his confessor by what good deed, as the king, might atone for his many sins as a man. The answer was ready. He was told that he must extirpate Protestantism in France. The Grand Monarch, as the age styled him, bowed obsequiously before the shaven crown of a priest, while Europe was trembling before his armies. Louis XIV did as he was commanded. He revoked the Edict of Nantes. This gigantic crime, which inflicted so much misery on the Protestants in the first place, and brought so many woes on the throne and nation of France in the second, will be recorded in its place. It is the nation of the Vaudois and the persecution which the council of Father Lachaise brought upon them, with which we have here to do. Wishing for companionship in the sanguinary act of purging France from Protestantism, Louis XIV sent an ambassador to the Duke of Savoy with a request that he would deal with the Waldensians as he was now dealing with the Huguenots. The young and naturally humane Victor Amadeus was at the moment on more than unusually friendly terms with his subjects of the valleys. They had served bravely under his standard in his late war with the Genoese, and he had but recently written them a letter of thanks. How could he unsheathe his sword against the men whose devotion and valor had so largely contributed to his victory? Victor Amadeus deigned no reply to the French ambassador. The request was repeated. It received an evasive answer. It was urged a third time, accompanied by a hint from the potent Louis that if it was not convenient for the Duke to purge his dominions, the King of France would do it for him with an army of 14,000 men, and would keep the valleys for his pains. This was enough. A treaty was immediately concluded between the Duke and the French king, in which the latter promised an armed force to enable the former to reduce the Vaudois to the Roman obedience, or to exterminate them. On the 31st of January, 1686, the following edict was promulgated in the valleys. 1. The Vaudois shall henceforth and forever cease and discontinue all the exercise of their religion. 2. They are forbidden to have religious meetings under pain of death and penalty of confiscation of all of their goods. 3. All their ancient privileges are abolished. 4. All the churches, prayer houses, and other edifices consecrated to their worship shall be razed to the ground. 5. All the pastors and schoolmasters of the valley are required either to embrace Romanism or to quit the country within 15 days under pain of death and confiscation of goods. 6. All the children born or to be born of Protestant parents shall be compulsorily trained up as Roman Catholics. Every such child yet unborn shall, within a week after its birth, be brought to the curate of its parish and admitted of the Roman Catholic Church, under pain, on the part of the mother, of being publicly whipped with rods, and on the part of the father, of laboring 5 years in the galleys. 7. The Vaudois pastors shall abjure the doctrine which they have hitherto publicly preached, shall receive a salary greater by 1/3 than that which they previously enjoyed, and 1/2 thereof shall go in revision to their widows. 8. All Protestant foreigners settled in Piedmont are ordered either to become Roman Catholics or quit the country within 15 days. 9. By a special act of his great and paternal clemency, the sovereign will permit persons to sell, in this interval, the property they may have acquired in Piedmont, provided the sale be made to Roman Catholic purchasers. This monstrous edict seemed the death knell of the Vaudois as a Protestant people. Their oldest history did not contain a decree so cruel and unrighteous, nor one that menaced them with so complete and summary a destruction as that which now seemed to impend over them. What was to be done? Their first step was to send delegates to Turin, respectfully to remind the Duke that the Vaudois had inhabited the valleys from the earliest times, that they had led forth their herds upon their mountains before the House of Savoy had ascended the throne of Piedmont, that treaties and oaths, renewed from reign to reign, had solemnly secured them in the freedom of their worship and other liberties, and that the honor of princes and the stability of states lay in the faithful observance of such covenants, and they prayed him to consider what reproach the throne and kingdom of Piedmont would incur if he should become the executioner of those of whom he was the natural protector. The Protestant cantons of Switzerland joined their mediations to the intercessions of the Waldenses, and when the almost incredible edict came to be known in Germany and Holland, these countries threw their shield over the valleys by interceding with the Duke, that he would not inflict so great a wrong as to cast out from a land which was theirs by irrevocable charters, a people whose only crime was that they worshipped as their fathers had worshipped, even before they passed under the scepter of the Duke. All these powerful parties pleaded in vain. Ancient charters, solemn treaties, and oaths, made in the face of Europe, long-tried loyalty, and the many services of the Vaudois to the House of Savoy, could not stay the uplifted arm of the Duke, nor prevent the execution of the monstrously criminal decree. In a short time the armies of France and Savoy arrived before the valley. At no previous period of their history, perhaps, had the Waldenses been so entirely devoid of human aid as now. Gianavello, whose stout heart and brave arm had stood them in such stead formerly, was in exile. Cromwell, whose potent voice had stayed the fury of the great Massacre, was in his grave. An avowed papist filled the throne of Great Britain. It was going ill at this hour with Protestants everywhere. The Covenanters of Scotland were hiding in the moors, or dying in the grass market of Edinburgh. France, Piedmont, and Italy were closing in around the valley. Every path guarded, all their help was cut off. An overwhelming force waited the signal to massacre them. So desperate did their situation appear to the Swiss envoys that they counseled them to transport elsewhere the torch of the gospel, and not keep it here to be extinguished in blood. The proposal to abandon their ancient inheritance, coming from such a quarter, startled the Waldenses, It produced at first a division of opinion in the valleys, but ultimately they united in rejecting it. They remembered the exploits their fathers had done, and the wonders God had wrought in the mountain passes of Rora, in the defiles of Angrogna, and in the field of the Pra del Tor. And their faith reviving, they resolved, in a reliance on the same almighty arm which had been stretched out in their behalf in former days, to defend their hearths and altars. They repaired to the old defenses, and made ready for resistance. On the 17th of April, being Good Friday, they renewed their covenant, and on Easter Sunday their pastors dispensed to them the communion. This was the last time the sons of the valley partook of the Lord's Supper before their great dispersion. Victor Amadeus II had pitched his camp on the plain of San Giganzo before the Vaudois Alps. His army consisted of 5 regiments of horse and foot. He was here joined by the French auxiliaries who had crossed the Alps, consisting of some dozen battalions, the united force amounting to between 15,000 and 20,000 men. The signal was to be given on Easter Monday, at break of day, by 3 cannon shots fired from the hill of Bricaraccio. On the appointed morning, the valleys of Lucerna and San Martino, forming the 2 extreme opposite points of the territory, were attacked, the first by the Piedmont host, and the last by the French, under the command of General Catinat, a distinguished soldier. In San Martino the fighting lasted 10 hours, and ended with the complete repulse of the French, who retired at night with a loss of more than 500 killed and wounded, while the Vaudois had lost only 2. On the following day the French, burning with rage at their defeat, poured a more numerous army into San Martino, which swept along the valley, burning, plundering, and massacring, and having crossed the mountains, descended into Prémol, continued the same indiscriminate and exterminating vengeance. To the rage of the sword were added other barbarities and outrages too shocking to be narrated. The issue by arms being deemed uncertain, despite the vast disparity of strength, treachery on a great scale was now had recourse to. Wherever, throughout the valleys, the Vaudois were found strongly posted and ready for battle, they were told that their brethren in the neighboring communities had submitted, and that it was in vain for them, isolated and alone as they were, to continue their resistance. When they sent deputies to headquarters to inquire, their passes were freely supplied to them for that purpose. They were assured that the submission had been universal, and that none save themselves were now in arms. They were assured, moreover, that should they follow the example of the rest of their nation, all their ancient liberties would be held intact. This base artifice was successfully practiced at each of the Vaudois posts in succession, till at length the valleys had all capitulated. We cannot blame the Waldenses, who were the victims of an act so dishonorable and vile as hardly to be credible, but the mistake, alas, was a fatal one, and had to be expiated afterwards by the endurance of woes 100 times more dreadful than any they would have encountered in the rudest campaign. The instant consequence of the submission was a massacre which extended to all their valleys, and which was similar in its horrors to the great butchery of 1655. In that massacre, upwards of 3,000 perished. The remainder of the nation, accounting, according to Arnaud, between 12,000 and 15,000 souls, were consigned to the various gaols and fortresses of Piedmont. We now behold these famous valleys, for the first time in their history, empty. The ancient lamp burns no longer. The school of the prophets in the Pra del Tor is razed. No smoke is seen rising from cottage, and no psalm is heard ascending from dwelling or sanctuary. No herdsman leads forth his kine on the mountains, and no troop of worshippers, obedient to the summons of the Sabbath bell, climbs the mountain path. The vine flings wide her arms, but no skilful hand is nigh to train her boughs and prune her luxuriance. The chestnut tree rains its fruits, but there is no group of merry children to gather them, and they lie rotting on the ground. The terraces of the hills, that were wont to overflow with flowers and fruit, and which presented to the eye a series of hanging gardens, now torn and breached, shoot in a mass of ruinous rubbish on the slope. Nothing is seen but dismantled forts, and the blackened ruins of churches and hamlets. A dreary silence overspreads the land, and the beasts of the field strangely multiply. A few herdsmen, hidden here and there in forests and holes of rocks, are now the only inhabitants. Monteviso, from out of the silent vault, looks down with astonishment at the absence of that ancient race over whom, from immemorial time, had been wont to dart his kindling glories at dawn, and let fall at eve the friendly mantle of his purple shadows. We know not if ever before an entire nation were in prison at once, yet now it was so. All of the Waldensian race that remained from the sword of their executioners were murmured in the dungeons of Piedmont. The pastor and his flock, the father and his family, the patriarch and the stripling had passed in one great procession, and exchanged their grand rock-walled valleys, their tree-embowered homes, and their sunlit peaks for the filth, the choking air, and the Tartarian walls of an Italian gaol. And how were they treated in prison? As the African slave was treated on the Middle Passage. They had a sufficiency of neither food nor clothing. The bread dealt out to them was fetid. They had putrid water to drink. They were exposed to sun by day and to cold at night. They were compelled to sleep on the bare pavement, or on straw so full of vermin that the stone floor was preferable. Disease broke out in these horrible abodes, and the mortality was fearful. When they entered these dungeons, says Henry Arnaud, they counted 14,000 healthy mountaineers, but when, at the intercession of Swiss deputies, their prisons were opened, 300 skeletons only crawled out. These few words portray a tragedy so awful that the imagination recoils from the contemplation of it. Well, at length the persecutor looses their chains, and opening their prison doors he sends forth these captives, the woe-war remnant of a gallant people. But to what are they sent forth? To people again their ancient valleys? To rekindle the fire on their ancestral hearths? To rebuild the holy and beautiful house in which their fathers had praised God? Ah, no, they are thrust out of prison only to be sent into exile, to Vaudois a living death. The barbarity of 1655 was repeated, as was in December of 1686. That the decree of the liberation was issued in favor of these 3,000 men who had escaped the sword and now survived the not less deadly epidemic of the prison. At that season, as everyone knows, the snow and ice are piled to a fearful depth on the Alps, and daily tempests threaten with death the too adventurous traveler who would cross their summits. It was at this season that these poor captives, emaciated with sickness, weakened by hunger, and shivering from insufficient clothing, were commanded to rise up and cross the snowy hills, to begin their journey on the afternoon of that day on which the order arrived, for their enemies would permit no delay. 150 of them died on their first march. At night they halted at the foot of Mont Cenis. Next morning, when they surveyed the Alps, they saw evident signs of a gathering tempest, and they besought the officer in charge to permit them, for the sake of their sick and aged, to remain where they were till the storm had spent its rage. With heart harder than the rocks they were to traverse, the officer ordered them to resume their journey. That troop of emaciated beings began the ascent, and were soon struggling with the blinding drifts and fearful whirlwinds of the mountains. 86 of their number, succumbing to the tempest, dropped by the way. Where they lay down, there they died. No relative or friend was permitted to remain behind to watch their last moments or tender to them needed comfort. That ever-thinning procession moved on and on over the white hills, leaving it to the falling snow to give burial to their stricken companions. When spring opened up the passes of the Alps, alas, what ghastly memorials met the eye of the horror-stricken traveler. Strewed along the track were now unshrouded corpses of these poor exiles, the dead child lying fast locked in the arms of the dead mother. But why should we prolong this harrowing tale? The first company of these miserable exiles arrived at Geneva on Christmas Day, 1686, having spent about 3 weeks on the journey. They were followed by small parties, who crossed the Alps one after the other, being let out of prison at different times. It was not until the end of February, 1687, that the last band of these emigrants reached the hospitable gates of Geneva. But in what a plight! Wayworn, sick, emaciated, and faint through hunger. Of some the tongue was swollen in the mouth, and they were unable to speak. Of others the arms were bitten with frost, so that they could not stretch them out to accept the charity offered to them. And some there were who dropped down and expired on the very threshold of the city, finding, as one has said, the end of their life at the beginning of their liberty. Most hospitable was the reception given them by the city of Calvin. A deputation of the principal citizens of Geneva, headed by the patriarch Gianavello, who still lived, went out to meet them on the frontier, and taking them to their homes, they vied with each other which should show them the greatest kindness. Generous city, if he who shall give a cup of cold water to a disciple shall in no wise lose his reward, how much more shalt thou be requited for this kindness to the suffering and sorrowing exiles of the Savior. Chapter 14. Return to the Valleys. Longings after their valleys. Thoughts of returning. Their reassembling. Cross the Leman. Begin their march. The 800. Cross Mount Cenis. Great victory in the valley of Rora. First view of their mountains. Worship on the mountaintop. Enter their valleys. Pass their first Sunday at Pillage. Worship. We now open the bright page of the Vaudois history. We have seen nearly 3,000 Waldensian exiles enter the gates of Geneva, the feeble remnant of a population of from 14,000 to 16,000. One city could not contain them all, and arrangements were made for the distributing of the expatriated Vaudois among the reformed cantons. The revocation of the Edict of Nantes had recently thrown thousands of French Protestants upon the hospitality of the Swiss, and now the arrival of the Waldensian refugees brought with it yet heavier demands on the public and private charity of the cantons. India was equally cordial in the case of the latecomers as in that of the first, and perhaps even more so, seeing their destitution was greater. Nor were the Vaudois ungrateful. Next to God, whose tender mercies have preserved us from being entirely consumed, said they to their kind benefactors, we are indebted to you alone for life and liberty. Several of the German princes opened their states to these exiles, but the influence of their great enemy, Louis XIV, was then too powerful in these parts to permit of their residence being altogether an agreeable one. Constantly watched by his emissaries and their patrons tampered with, they were moved about from place to place. The question of their permanent settlement in the future was beginning to be anxiously discussed. The project of carrying them across the sea in the ships of Holland and planting them at the Cape was even talked of. The idea of being separated forever from their native land, dearer in exile than when they dwelt in it, gave them intolerable anguish. Was it not possible to reassemble their scattered colonies, and marching back to their valleys, rekindle their ancient lamp in them? This was the question which, after 3 years of exile, the Vaudois began to ask themselves. As they wandered by the banks of the Rhine, or traversed the German plains, they feasted their imaginations on their far-off home. The chestnuts shading their former abodes, the vine bending gracefully over their portal, and the meadow in front, which the crystal torrent kept perpetually bright, and whose murmur sweetly blended with the evening psalm, all rose before their eyes. They never knelt to pray, but it was with their faces turned toward their grand mountains, where slept their martyred fathers. Attempts had been made by the Duke of Savoy to people their territory by settling it in a mongrel race, partly Irish and partly Piedmont, but the land knew not the strangers and refused to yield its strength to them. The Vaudois had sent spies to examine its condition. Its fields lay untilled, its vines unpruned, nor had its ruins been raised up. It was almost as desolate as on the day when its sons had been driven out of it. It seemed to them that the land was waiting for their return. At length the yearning of their heart could no longer be repressed. The march back to their valley is one of the most wonderful exploits ever performed by any people. It is famous in history by the name of La Contrée Glorieuse. The parallel event which will recur to the mind of the scholar is, of course, the retreat of the 10,000 Greeks. The patriotism and bravery of both will be admitted, but a candid comparison will, we think, incline one to assign the palm of heroism to the return of the 800. The day fixed on for their beginning their expedition was the 10th of June, 1688. Quitting their various cantonments in Switzerland and traveling the byroads, they traversed the country by night and assembled at Bex, a small town in the southern extremity of the territory of Bern. Their secret march was soon known to the senates of Zurich, Bern, and Geneva, and foreseeing that the departure of the exiles would compromise them with the popish powers, their excellencies took measures to prevent it. A bark laden with arms for their use was seized on the Lake of Geneva. The inhabitants of the Valais, in concert with the Savoys, at the first alarm seized the bridge of St. Maurice, the key of the Rhone Valley, and stopped the expedition. Thus they were compelled at the time to abandon their project. To extinguish all hopes of their return to the valleys, they were anew distributed over Germany, but scarcely had these second dispersions been effected when war broke out. The French troops overran the Palatinate, and the Vaudois settled there, dreading not without reason the soldiers of Louis XIV, retired before them and retook the road to Switzerland. The Protestant cantons, pitying these poor exiles, tossed from country to country by political storms, settled them once more in their former allotments. Meanwhile the scenes were shifting rapidly around the expatriated Vaudois, and with eyes uplifted they waited the issue. They saw their protector, William of Orange, mount the throne of England. They saw their powerful enemy, Louis XIV, attacked at once by the Emperor and humiliated by the Dutch. They saw their own prince, Victor Amadeus, withdraw his soldiers from Savoy, seeing that he needed them to defend Piedmont. It seemed to them that an invisible hand was opening their path back to their own land. Encouraged by these tokens, they began to arrange a second time for their departure. The place of appointed rendezvous was a wood on the northern shore of the Leman, near the town of Noyon. For days they continued to converge in scattered bands and by stealthy marches on the selected point. On the decisive evening, the 16th of August, 1689, a general muster took place under cover of the friendly wood of Prangons. Having by solemn prayer commended their enterprise to God, they embarked on the lake and crossed by starlight. Their means of transport would have been deficient but for a circumstance which threatened at first to obstruct their expedition, but which in the issue greatly facilitated it. Curiosity had drawn numbers to this part of the lake, and the boats that brought hither the sightseers furnished more amply the means of escape to the Vaudois. At this crisis, as on so many previous ones, a distinguished man arose to lead them, Henry Arnaud, whom we see at the head of the 800 fighting men who are setting out for their native possessions. Had at first discharged the office of pastor, but the troubles of his nation compelling him to leave the valleys, he had served in the armies of the Prince of Orange. Of decided piety, ardent patriotism, and of great decision and courage, he presented a beautiful instance of the union of the pastoral and the military character. It is hard to say whether his soldiers listened more reverently to the exhortations he at times delivered to them from the pulpit, or to the orders he gave them on the field of battle. Arriving on the southern shore of the lake, these 800 Vaudois bent their knees in prayer, and then began their march through a country covered with foes. Before them rose the great snow-clad mountains over which they were to fight their way. Arnaud arranged his little host into 3 companies, an advance guard, a center, and a rear guard. Seizing some of the chief men as hostages, they traversed the valley of the Arve to Salinches, and emerged from its dangerous passes just as the men of the latter place had completed their preparations for resisting them. Occasional skirmishes awaited them, but mostly their march was unopposed, for the terror of God had fallen upon the inhabitants of Savoy. Holding on their way, they climbed the Haut Luce Alp, and next that of Bon Homie, the neighboring Alp, to Mont Blanc, sinking sometimes to their middle in snow. Steep precipice and treacherous glaciers subjected them to both toil and danger. They were wet through the rain, which at times fell in torrents. Their provisions were growing scanty, but their supply was recruited by the shepherds of the mountains, who brought them bread and cheese, while their huts served them at night. They renewed their hostages at every stage. Sometimes they caged, to use their own phrase, a Capuchin monk, and at other times an influential landlord, but all were treated with uniform kindness. Having crossed the Bon Homie, which divides the basin of the Arve from that of the Isère, they descended, on Wednesday, the 5th day of their march, into the valley of the latter stream. They had looked forward to this stage of their journey with great misgivings, for the numerous population of the Val Isère was known to be well armed and decidedly hostile, and might be expected to oppose their march. But the enemy was still as a stone, till the people had passed over it. They next traversed Mont Iserain, and the yet more formidable Mont Cenis, and finally descended into the valley of the Rora. It was here, on Saturday, the 24th of August, that they encountered for the first time a considerable body of regular troops. As they traversed the valley, they were met by a peasant, whom they inquired whether they could have provisions by paying for them. "Come this way," said the man, in a tone that had a slight touch of triumph in it. "You will find all that you want. They are preparing an excellent supper for you." They were led into the defile of Salabertrand, where the Col de Albin closes in upon the stream of Dora, and before they were aware they found themselves in presence of the French army, whose campfires, for night had fallen, illumined far and wide the opposite slope. Retreat was impossible. The French were 2,500 strong, flanked by the garrison of exiles, and supported by a miscellaneous crowd of armed followers. Under favor of the darkness, they advanced to the bridge which crossed the Dora, on the opposite bank of which the French were encamped. To the challenge, "Who goes there?" the Vaudois answers, "Friends." The instant reply, shouted out, was "Kill! Kill!" followed by a tremendous fire, which was kept up for a quarter of an hour. It did no harm, however, for Arnaud had bidden his soldiers lie flat on their faces and permit the deadly shower to pass over them. But now a division of the French appeared in the rear, thus placing them between two fires. Someone in the Vaudois army, seeing that all must be risked, shouted out, "Courage! The bridge is won!" At these words, the Vaudois started to their feet, rushed across the bridge sword in hand, and clearing it, they threw themselves with the suddenness of a whirlwind upon the enemy's entrenchments. Confounded by the speed of the attack, the French could only use the butt ends of their muskets to parry the blows. The fighting lasted 2 hours, and ended in the total rout of the French. Their leader, the Marquis de Léry, after a fruitless attempt to rally his soldiers, fled wounded to Briangon, exclaiming, "Is it possible that I have lost the battle and my honor?" Soon thereafter the moon rose and showed the field a battle to the victors. On it, stretched out in death, lay 600 French soldiers, besides officers, and strewn promiscuously with the fallen all over the field were arms, military stores, and provisions. Thus had been suddenly opened an armory and magazines to men who stood much in need of both weapons and food. Having amply replenished themselves, they collected what they could not carry away into a heap, and set fire to it. The loud and multifarious noises formed by the explosions of the gunpowder, the sounding of the trumpets, and the shouting of the captains, who, throwing their caps in the air, exclaimed, "Thanks be to the Lord of hosts, who has given us the victory," echoed like the thunder of heaven, and reverberating from hill to hill, formed a most extraordinary and exciting scene, and one that is seldom witnessed amid these usually quiet mountains. This great victory cost the Waldenses only 15 killed and 12 wounded. Their fatigue was great, but they feared to halt on the battlefield, and so rousing those who had already sunk to sleep, they commenced climbing the lofty Mount Si. The day was breaking as they gained the summit. It was Sunday, and Henry Arnaud, halting till all should assemble, pointed out to them, just as they were becoming visible in the morning light, the mountain tops of their own land. Welcome sight to their loving eyes. Bathed in the radiance of the rising sun, it seemed to them, as one snowy peak began to burn after another, that the mountains were kindling into joy at the return of their long-absent sons. This army of soldiers resolved itself into a congregation of worshippers, and the summit of Mount Si became their church. Kneeling on the mountain-top, the battlefield below them, and the solemn and sacred peaks of the Col de Piz, the Col de Becerra, and the glorious pyramid of Monte Viso looking down upon them in reverent silence, they humbled themselves before the Eternal, confessing their sins and giving thanks for their many deliverances. Seldom has worship more sincere or more rapt been offered than that which this day ascended from this congregation of warrior worshippers gathered under the dome-like vault that rose over them. Refreshed by the devotions of the Sunday, and exhilarated by the victory of the day before, the heroic band now rushed down to take possession of their inheritance, from which the single valley of Clusson only parted them. It was 3 years and a half since they had crossed the Alps, a crowd of exiles, worn to skeletons by sickness and confinement. And now they were returning a marshaled host, victorious over the army of France, and ready to encounter that of Piedmont. They traversed the Clusson, a plain of about 2 miles in width, watered by the broad, clear, blue-tinted Germagnasca, and bounded by the hills, which offer to the eye a succession of terraces, clothed with the richest vines, mingled with the chestnut and the apple tree. They entered the narrow defile of the Pi, where a detachment of Piedmont soldiers had been posted to guard the pass, but who took flight at the approach of the Vaudois, thus opening to them the gate of one of the grandest of their valleys, San Martino, On the 12th day after setting out from the shores of the Leman, they crossed the frontier and stood once more within the limits of their inheritance. When they mustered at Balsiglia, the first Vaudois village which they entered, in the western extremity of San Martino, they found that fatigue, desertion, and battle had reduced their numbers from 800 to 700. Their first Sunday after their return was passed at the village of Prailly. Of all their sanctuaries, the church of Prailly alone remained standing. Of the others only the ruins were to be seen. They resolved to recommence this day their ancient and scriptural worship, purging the church of its popish ornaments. One half of the little army, laying down their arms at the door, entered the edifice, while the other half stood without, the church being too small to contain them all. Henry Arnaud, the soldier pastor, mounting a table which was placed in the porch, preached to them. They began their worship by chanting the 74th Psalm. O God, why hast thou cast us off forever? Why doth thine anger smoke against the sheep of thy pasture? The preacher then took as his text the 129th Psalm. Many a time have they afflicted me from my youth, may Israel now say. The wonderful history of this people behind them, so to speak, and the reconquest of their land before them, we can imagine how thrilling every word of his discourse must have been, and how it must have called up the glorious achievements of their fathers, provoking the generous emulation of their sons. The worship was closed by these 700 warriors, chanting in magnificent choir the psalm from which their leader had preached. So passed their first Sunday in their land. To many it seems significant that here the returned exiles should spend their first Sunday and resume their sanctuary services. They remembered how this same village of Prailly had been the scene of a horrible outrage at the time of their exodus. The pastor of Prailly, M. Lydet, a singularly pious man, had been discovered by the soldiers as he was praying under a rock, and being dragged forth, he was first tortured and mutilated, and then hanged, his last words being, Lord Jesus, receive my spirit. It was surely appropriate, after the silence of 3 years and a half, during which the rage of the persecutor had forbidden the preaching of the glorious gospel, that its reopening should take place in the pulpit of the martyr Lydet. I wish to express a special thanks to all the supporters of First Amendment Radio and our mission on true prophecy reformation. If you would like to support the work here with a special one-time gift, it would be greatly appreciated. We, however, always prefer an ongoing, faithful gift of support for the labor that continues here always. So please consider carefully how much you are able to continue without undue hardship to your own household. In the least, please like and share and subscribe wherever you are receiving this work. Thank you. Secrets of the Rapture. Is there a 500-year-old conspiracy? A propaganda machine so pervasive and entrenched, yet so elusive that the entire world could be taken in by it, working in plain sight, but unseen by the world for what it truly is? If prophecy is God-given history in advance, why does the prophecy that has conquered the age also exclude nearly 2,000 years of history? What is it that they are afraid that the light of history will reveal? To understand our place in time and prophecy, we must look in history for an interpretation, that which stands the test of time, that which agrees with the Word of God, and history has proven to be true. When cunning fables and fearful speculations are removed from our sight, then we may clearly see what is truly expressed in Bible prophecy, both that which has been fulfilled and that which has yet to come. God's express word is the sword that must be wielded to remove the scales from the eyes and dispel the darkness of deceitful conjecture. Secrets of the Rapture was written to expose that which the spirit of the age has conjured out of the darkness to blind the eyes of the church in the world today. Secrets of the Rapture, Deconstructing Pre-Tribulation Dispensational Futurism by yours truly, Nicholas Arthur, is now available at Amazon. Secrets of the Rapture,